Hello and welcome back. I'm now going to give you part 2 of part 3 series on my testimony. In January 2013, I asked the Lord what his word was for the year, and he said, love. The next morning, I saw a heart actually formed in the grass on my front lawn, and I am not joking. And then I was given 1 Corinthians 13, which we all know is the text on love. In June of that year, on my birthday, Michael had been asked by the pastor if he would answer some questions at the front of the church. And I remember feeling really upset about it, as it was my birthday and I had wanted to spend the day together celebrating. Michael said he wanted to go to the church, and so off we went. During the interview, the pastor asked him what was the best decision he had ever made in his life. And he said, "The best decision I have ever made in my life is to have married Linda." I was in total shock at these words, as our relationship was fraught with unresolved issues. But nevertheless, they pierced deep into my heart and brought me a warm feeling. I was to recall them many times during the season, which was about to commence. Because 6 weeks later, after he had uttered those words, my husband told me he was leaving me. And the Lord spoke very clearly from the Bible and through other Christians that I was not to persuade him to stay this time, but to release him and let him go. Interestingly, I had totally forgotten the meeting with God in the kitchen 2 years previous, and would only remember my promise to put my marriage on the altar a year on into the separation. From the moment Michael uttered those words, "I am leaving," it was as if I had suddenly become a complete stranger to him. But the Lord told me how he had hardened his heart. As word got out and more people heard about the situation, I was embarrassed, humiliated, self-righteous and angry. However, as the weeks went by and there were no signs of my husband returning, I began to feel completely broken by the whole experience. I feel to mention at this point that during the 3 years, communication with Holy Spirit became very intimate. I heard the voice of God accurately and clearly, and he directed my every significant move. Not only that, God became my husband and looked after me better than any earthly husband had ever done. I would even pray for my lawn to be mown, and he would drop the thought into my husband's head to send a gardener. I also had a roof over my head, and yes, I was tested, but still all my needs were more than adequately taken care of. My whole living pattern changed for those 3 years. I no longer lived as I had done, but would spend hours and hours in communion with God, not only during the day, but also during the night. He was closer than I had ever known him, which I desperately needed as I went through the initial pain of separation, abandonment, rejection, shame, humiliation, despair, depression, and physical, heartfelt pain at the breaking of our covenant. His grace and tender words of love and encouragement got me through the first stage of this experience, which was undoubtedly for me sheer agony. On a positive note, of course, I can now empathise so much with those going through the same experience and bring to them the love and the hope of Jesus. A couple of months down the line, I was given a book on the fruit of the Holy Spirit, and as I began to read it, the Lord gently convicted me of the many occasions I had not displayed this fruit to my husband. I cried bucket loads as godly sorrow hit me in waves. And I wrote Michael a letter telling him that I was sorry for the times I had been ungracious. The reply I received was anything but what I had hoped for, as he told me he was never coming back. I think it was at this point in my journey that I no longer wished to live. I obviously went to God, and although I did not get anything tangible, I had a deep sense that somehow God was in all of what was happening and that he definitely had not left me. One morning, not long after the letter, the Holy Spirit told me quite out of the blue to start taking gifts to Michael's office, which was about 12 miles away. I was to do this over a period of 40 days and deliver the gifts to the door of his office or his car, but in secret. So I sent him tulips, I made him meals, I bought him sweets and chocolates and wine and beer and decorated the gifts with hearts. But instead of him warming towards me, he took out his car from the car park to try and hide from me. And then he asked me to stop sending him gifts. One day, I had just delivered a gift to Michael, and upon my return, I saw a plant pot on my doorstep. It had hearts on it, and my heart leapt. I thought it was Michael that had sent it. This was not the case, however, and I was so bitterly disappointed. It was at this point, at the beginning of my journey, that a significant truth was revealed to me. And it was this: I actually loved Michael more than I loved Jesus, because it was Jesus that had sent me that gift, obviously through the hands of someone else, but it was Jesus. I thought I had loved Jesus and made him first in my life, but like Peter, when the chips were down, the truth came out. My love, although sincere, was similar to the initial love of the Shulamite, and quite shallow. Like her, I had begged God to reveal himself to me in a deeper way than I had ever known. I had told him many times how I loved him, and I really had an intense yearning for an experiential Christian walk, as opposed to just being a pew warmer on a Sunday. I wanted more than just head knowledge. And here he was answering my prayer, just as he answered the Shulamite's prayer, but in a way neither of us could have anticipated or were ready for. He had to love us into surrender and kiss us with the kisses of his mouth so many times. The Lord literally wooed me into his heart, and he was absolutely lavish in his love for me. He sent me flowers and clothes, holidays, chocolates. He really did. It took 3 years of his awesome covenantal love to free me of the dependence on and the need for an earthly husband. But Jesus became more than enough, and joy filled my heart once again. There is also a point to mention here. I now see, for example, how the Lord lovingly blesses us with his gifts and provision, and so often we don't appreciate all that he does. However, does that stop him from loving us, or does it deter him in any way? Does he stop loving and pursuing and wooing? No, not at all. When we said yes to Jesus, he became our covenantal God. When we marry and enter into the covenant of marriage before God, both parties make a legally binding promise to live until death do us part for the highest good of the other. Covenant is a God-made ordinance, and it is a very serious matter and not to be entered into lightly. Jesus revealed himself to me as the true and faithful covenant keeper, and I, by God's grace, was enabled to do the same for my husband. This is Jesus' testimony through me, and is an illustration to God's people of his never-ending, boundless love and commitment to us. Read on to see what happens when someone violates the covenant. I remember vividly that first Christmas. I awoke on Christmas Day all alone, but a few days before, my daughter had kindly invited me and my 2 sons to stay with her for a couple of nights. We were all together in the park, and I can only describe what I felt as a knife cutting into my heart. The pain of it is beyond words, but I got a sensing that this was something to do with the depth of pain involved when covenantal relationships are broken, and the Lord feels it too. It took Holy Spirit 6 months of ministry to my heart before I slowly but surely began to gain some degree of peace. During this period, I met up with my husband at my son's school a few times, and on each occasion the Lord had told me to keep on loving him. Often I would pick my husband up and drop him off so that he could have a glass of wine. But although I would tell him that this was not God's plan for our lives and that we were in covenant, the answer I got was always the same: I'm not coming back. As I mentioned earlier, the experience of God's love towards me was beyond anything I had ever experienced. And of course, it was this love that was pouring out to my husband, who, although totally impervious to it, could not stop the flow. I did everything I could to love my husband from a distance, and I still hadn't realised that God was teaching me about himself and about his love. There was still, however, a long way to go. It was a Saturday, and I had enjoyed the whole day with the Lord. Part of the time was spent meditating on the writings of St. John of the Cross. Suddenly, Holy Spirit came upon me and began to flood me with waves of love. Wave after wave broke upon me, and I could have died on the spot and not given a hoot. It was literally divine ecstasy, and I fell to my knees in complete brokenness and worship before the Lord. I don't quite know how long it went on for, but it was definitely not more than 10 minutes, and yet the whole encounter left me quite exhausted. But I had a feeling of unbelievable joy and satisfaction and deep peace. After I had recovered, the Lord spoke into my heart and asked me to lay down absolutely everything. My money, my home, my car, even down to my mobile phone. These were things that at that time my husband was still paying for. Little did I know that God was breaking my dependence on my husband and redirecting it to himself. As you can imagine, I was quite frightened because I didn't know what would happen if I did this. And I also noticed that this had just happened after he had poured in his love. So, despite not knowing where I was going to go or how I was going to manage, I was able to say yes. And what ensued is an amazing story. I wrote to Michael and I told him I was going to deliver everything back to him. But he was very unhappy about it and said that the support I was getting was rightfully mine. In the past, I had always felt that I had received things grudgingly, and I'm not saying that that was Michael's problem. It was my problem. I believed the lies of the enemy, but I always used to think that I wasn't worth very much at all, and I always used to depend on Michael for everything. But God was showing me that he was my provider and he was my source of everything. When I had laid down everything, I was then shown a house to rent that would have been suitable had I moved. But just as I was about to move, God told me that he'd put me to the test to redirect my focus from my husband as provider to him as my source of everything. And there is an interesting lesson for us all here, in that I had first needed the love of God to enable me to surrender. Oftentimes I have heard preachers talk to congregations about how we should be evangelizing and doing this or that, but unless, firstly, we really know the one whom we are talking about and what he thinks about us, how can we be real witnesses? How can we reveal Jesus' love to the world unless we have experienced him for ourselves? My second Christmas on this journey was one of the best Christmases I have ever had as the children were with me. I did not have the money to buy all that was required, but my faithful heavenly husband came to the rescue. A couple of weeks before, my daughter rang me to say that her father, my second husband, the lawyer, had told her that he was paying for everything, even down to the tree. Oh, and the food came from Booths, which is the northern version of Waitrose. When I came off the phone, I was overjoyed. I couldn't believe it. And then I opened my Bible, and it opened at Psalm 111, verse 5. He provides food for those who fear him. He remembers his covenant forever. How awesome is that? I didn't see my husband for a couple of months prior to this Christmas, as the Lord was doing a work of healing and strengthening of my heart. As you can appreciate, it was no easy task having to keep meeting up with someone you love and you appear visible in their eyes. I gained some consolation from the knowledge that God had hardened Michael's heart, but it was still very difficult, and I had no idea how long I had to walk this path. Shortly before my son broke up for the Christmas holidays, the Lord directed me to resume contact with my husband, and we went to a carol service at my boys' school. Shortly after that, I received instruction to buy Michael a very expensive briefcase and to send him the best gifts I could for Christmas. I remember arguing with the Lord because it was all so expensive, but Holy Spirit insisted, even though it literally wiped out what little emergency funds I had. Oh, how my prayer is that you see how precious and loved you are by God. So often the devil tries to condemn us when we fall short. But this story of mine is absolute proof that God just keeps loving no matter what, even more than that. His love is the best, the kindest, the most selfless. My husband didn't deserve to be getting presents from me, and certainly not the best ones of all. But I had to do this in order that we might come to the truth of this amazing love. None of us deserve to be loved like this, but we are, and there are no words to describe our awesome God. Fairest of the fair, faithful and true is he, and his love inextinguishable, as you will see from the third and final part of my story.